Hello, and welcome again to the story time of Rita's Roost. Well, we're on chapter 7 of The Persian Pickle Club by Sandra Dallas. Are we going to find out who killed old Mr. Ben Crook? I don't know, but we're going to read and see. This is one of my favorite times of the day. It's just quiet and relaxing. I come up here to my little she shed where it's just me. I hope it's just nice and quiet. Alright, chapter 7. When we left the Judds, I hoped Rita was ready to give up and go home. I was tired of being a reporter's helper and didn't like people frowning at me. But she insisted we had to talk to the sheriff, so I drove us up to Harveyville. It was a Friday. No old bachelors leaned against the Flint Hills home and feed. Socializing was Saturday work, and the few people in town that day were hurrying to finish errands so they could go home and get their chores done and be back in town by dark. A sign on the door of the home and feed read, "Movie tonight, sundown." On Friday nights, the home and feed set up a big projector outside and beamed a motion picture on the side of the building. People brought their chairs from home so they could sit in the street and watch it. Tonight's picture was Murders in the Rue Morgue. I thought I'd had enough of murder that day, so I wouldn't ask Grover to take me. Harveyville wasn't any gasoline alley. Only one car was parked on the street, and it was in front of the sheriff's office, a Hudson Super 6 with last year's license plate on it. The car had been there more than a year, ever since Pap Logan parked it in that spot, then walked into the street without looking and was hit by a farm kid in an old Willie's Overland. Pap was laid up in bed for months, and even today he couldn't walk without crutches, so he never went back for the Hudson. He wouldn't let anyone else drive it either, so it just stayed there. The tires were flat. When I pulled closer so you can hear me better. When I pulled in next to the Super 6, Sheriff Eagles was sitting on the running board on the car's shady side, whittling a stick with his pocket knife. I turned off the engine, and Rita and I got out. "This is better than a front porch swing," Sheriff Eagles said, not getting up, although he touched the brim of his hat to us. "You know Rita Ritter?" I asked, while the sheriff nodded how-do at Rita. "She's Tom's wife. She wants to talk to you." He squinted at Rita. "You writing up another article about Ben Crook?" "Did you read the first one?" Rita asked, smoothing the wrinkles out of her skirt. She lifted it when people told her she liked it when people told her they read her newspaper stories. "I guess everybody in Harveyville's read it," he said, and turned away to spit. "At least everybody in Harveyville's told me you didn't spell my name right. It was Eagles with an S on the end of it, not Eagle. You know, not just one bird, a whole flock of 'em." Rita nodded, embarrassed, and turned red, and Sheriff Eagles told her, "Oh, heck, that's all right, sis. Everybody spells it wrong." "It doesn't matter what you say, just spell my name right," Rita muttered. The sheriff looked at me, and I shrugged because I didn't know what Rita meant any more than he did. He asked, "How's that?" "It's just an old newspaper saying," Rita explained. She put her elbows on the Hudson so she could get closer to the sheriff, but it slipped away, and Rita nearly fell. She straightened up then leaned over to Sheriff Eagles. "You don't mind being in the newspaper, do you, Sheriff Eagles?" She pronounced Eagles as if it ended in a whole string of S's. "Can't say it's any worse than a poke in the eye with the sharp stick." Rita laughed hard, although I'd heard that expression 1,000 times and didn't see why she thought it was so funny. She started to reply, then noticed that several people on the sidewalk had stopped to listen. So she said, "Why don't we go inside to talk?" "Suit yourself." Sheriff Eagles took his time, however, as he carefully folded the knife and put it into his pocket, then slowly got to his feet. He brushed the dirt off the seat of his pants, but not on the back of his shirt, which was dusty from leaning against the car. Rita and I followed him into the office, Rita whispering to me, "Where's his gun?" Sheriff Eagles put his fist on his waist and turned to Rita. "What do I need a gun for?" I thought lawmen always carried guns, Rita said. This is Harveyville, Kansas, not Dodge City, Kansas, he said. It ain't Abilene, Kansas either, he added. But I think Rita had already gotten the point. It's not. He couldn't think of another Wild West place in Kansas and shook his head. You don't need a gun to sit on the running board of a Super 6 in Harveyville. Sheriff Eagles winked at me, and I winked back, then decided he might think I was siding with him against Rita, so I reached up and rubbed my eye as if I'd gotten a cinder in it. I'd never been in the sheriff's office before, and I was as disappointed with it as Rita was with Sheriff Eagles not carrying a gun. It was just a dusty room with an old wooden desk and a chair with an Indian blanket folded up for a cushion. Against the wall stood a rusty wood stove with dirty coffee cups on it. The computer was flashing. Don't know what it was doing. All right. Go back to the story. A row of upright bars like an armed fence marked off the jail end of the room, and you could see right through it onto the 2 bunks and a slop jar. I wondered how anybody who was locked up in there had the privacy to go to the bathroom. I wished Rita would ask Sheriff Eagles about that. The sheriff sat down behind the desk and leaned forward on his elbows, squinting at us. He didn't invite us to sit down, but Rita pulled up a chair, and I found one for myself. Rita, I started to tell the sheriff, but she cut me off with a sharp look. I should have learned by now that she wanted to ask the questions. Rita leaned forward and smiled at the sheriff. I'm writing a follow-up to that story you read, and I'll make sure I spell your name right this time. You do that. You wouldn't have a pencil, would you? Rita asked, and the sheriff rummaged around in the drawer and found a tiny pencil with a broken lead. You got a penknife so I can sharpen it? He asked. I was about to ask what was wrong with the one that was in his pocket, but Rita said, never mind. She opened her pocketbook and took out my pencil stub and poised it over her pad of paper. The smile disappeared from her face, and she narrowed her eyes at the sheriff and asked, who killed Ben Crook? Sheriff Eagles looked at her as if she'd just asked him what day of the year we would get the next hard rain. How the hell do I know, sis, he replied. Begging your pardon, ma'am, he said that to me. Don't you know? I'm working on it. Ben Crook died more than a year ago. There ain't a whole lot of evidence left around. I didn't find anybody's name and address written down and stuck inside Ben's overall pocket. Did you find any weapons? Nah, Ben was killed someplace else and hauled there in an automobile. The man who done it most likely used a 2x4 or maybe a piece of cordwood to kill him. He did a right smart job of it, judging from the way Ben's skull was bashed in. It was a doozy. Rita gave me a I told you so look before she licked the end of her pencil with her tongue, but she didn't write down anything. What leads do you have? Why would I tell you? You'd put it in the newspaper, wouldn't you? And the fellow who done it would run off. Ain't that about right? Sheriff Eagles leaned back in his chair, looking pleased with himself. He glanced at me. Keep looking at my computer. Excuse me. All right. He glanced at me, but even though I thought he had been pretty quick, I frowned. After all, I was on Rita's side. I'm betting you don't have any idea at all. Rita put the pencil down and stared at the sheriff. In a minute, he looked away. Am I right? Rita asked. No, you're not right, the sheriff mimicked, his chair squeaking as he leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. Then who killed him? Sis, I'm not telling you anything. If you ask me, it ain't your business. It's my business if there's a killer loose in Wabausie County. After all, I live here too. It's as much my business as it is yours or Queenie's. I'm going to write that you don't know who killed Mr. Crook. That's so? Well, I guess if you want to write lies, there's nothing I can do to stop you. The two of them looked at each other for a full minute without saying a word. Well, I thought Rita would be better off if she knew that she could catch more flies with honey than vinegar. She should have learned that from talking to the judge. What about Hiawatha? She asked, yanking off her earrings and dropping them into her pocketbook. Hiawatha Jackson? How many Hiawathas are there in Harveyville? She'd picked up that line from Nettie the day she'd called Lizzie Olive, and I wanted to laugh, but I kept my mouth shut because the sheriff didn't think Rita was funny. What about him? Nice fellow, ain't he? And he don't fight like some of your... Do you think he did it? Why would Hiawatha Jackson kill Ben? Was they acquainted? Hiawatha came down from Blue Hill after Ben disappeared. How do you know that? Rita asked. But the sheriff only looked smug. I could have told Rita why the sheriff knew, but she'd made it clear that he didn't want any interference, so I didn't speak up. The two of them kept at it like that, each trying to trip the other one up, but not getting anywhere, and I stopped listening to look out the window. Being a newspaper reporter was a boring way to earn your living, not interesting like farming. I wondered if I should tell the sheriff about Velma's married boyfriend, Charlie, having a run-in with Ben Crook. After all, I hadn't promised Velma I wouldn't let the sheriff know Charlie had threatened Ben. Still, if I told, I'd have to explain how I knew about him, and that would make things even worse for Velma. I kept Charlie to myself. I turned back to Rita and Sheriff Eagles when he yanked at a desk drawer that was stuck and wiggled it open. He removed a sheet of paper and handed it to Rita, who turned it around and read it. She cocked her pretty head and smiled at the sheriff. You went over that site quite thoroughly, it seems to me. This list looks like it's got everything on it. It's a good murder report as I ever read. That didn't mean anything because Rita had told me this was the first crime she'd ever written about, but the sheriff didn't know that. He looked pleased with himself and said, I know a thing or two, I guess. I can see that all right. Maybe Rita knew about flies and honey after all. How about tramps? Grover said backdoor moochers started showing up about the time Ben was killed. Do you think one of them did it? I asked, avoiding Rita's eyes just in case she was mad that I butted in. Sheriff Eagles nodded his head up and down, which meant he was thinking, but not agreeing with me. Grover ain't as dumb as he looks, is he, Queenie? The fact is, Ella said there was a tramp who went through her place the day Ben disappeared. She thought it was odd the way he showed up in the middle of the morning instead of at mealtime, when most of those fellows come looking for handouts. Rita's eyes lit up, and I guess she was glad I'd asked because she said, Do you think he did it? The sheriff shook his head. Ella said he had one leg gone and a hand that was all drawed up, so he couldn't be the responsible party. It took a strong man to kill Ben, to bash him in the head like that, then haul him over to that grave. Ben was a big man. Big like Skillet, I said. The sheriff looked up at me quickly, then rubbed his chin with his hand. There were stubble patches on his face where the razor had missed his whiskers. I already thought of that, he said. Who's Skillet? Rita asked. The sheriff and I looked at each other, then he nodded at me to answer, and I replied, Ben's hired man. Skillet who? She asked. I shrugged. I never knew his last name. Did you, Sheriff? Nope, Ella never asked. A man who goes by one name don't want you to know the other one. If Ella pressed him for it, he'd have made one up. I bet you a nickel his first name wasn't Skillet either. The sheriff stuck out his chin as if he was waiting for one of us to tell him how smart he was. Do you think Skillet did it? Rita asked. Sheriff Eagles leaned back in his chair and put his fingers together. Then he stuck out his lower lip as if he was thinking. Rita fidgeted, which seemed to tickle the sheriff as he looked around the room, dragging out his answer. Maybe so. Skillet was strong. I know he had a hot temper 'cause he worked for a farmer over in Skokomo until a pig riled him and he killed it with a pitchfork. Skillet hightailed it over here and hired on with Ben. The farmer wanted me to get Skillet to pay for the pig, but I told him if Skillet had that kind of money, he wouldn't be a hired hand for Ben Crook. Hell, I wouldn't want to tangle with Skillet any more than I would Ben. Each one of 'em was nastier than the other. All you had to do was look at Skillet to know you'd best keep your distance. He had a face ugly enough to clabber milk. Well, did he do it? Rita asked one more time. Clabber milk? The sheriff was enjoying himself. Rita wasn't, however. She stared flint-eyed at the sheriff, waiting for him to answer. Probably not. How can you be so sure? Because he took off before being disappeared is how I know for sure. Where did he go? Now, how would I know that? I got better things to do than stop every drifter that goes through Harveyville and ask for his traveling plans. The sheriff stood up. I guess that's about all I've got to say. I don't get paid for talking. Can I say Skillet is a suspect? Rita asked as she and I stood up. You can say everybody in Wabanese County a suspect, including Queenie. He sent me a sideways look and rolled his tongue under his upper lip to show he was joking. Rita and I went back to the car and got in. When I glanced over at Rita, she had a smug expression on her face. You think Skillet did it, don't you? I asked. I hoped if she put Skillet into her story, Rita would remember he was my idea. But Rita shook her head, catching the feather of her hat on the car roof. She removed the hat to examine the feather, which was broken in half. He just threw in that Skillet person to fool me, but I'm too smart to fall for it. I was confused. You mean you don't think Skillet did it? I don't think he did it at all, but I've got a pretty good idea who did it. Who? I gasped. It's a secret. If I told you, you'd tell somebody. Instead of looking at me, Rita held her right hand, the fingers pressed wide, examining her nails, which were freshly polished. I turned my head away without a word and started the car. Rita had no call to insult me. I could keep a secret as well as anybody. Shoot, I could keep a secret from Grover if I had to. I knew I could even keep one from Rita. We didn't talk as I drove Rita back to the Ritter place. I suppose I was pouting while she was thinking about whoever killed Ben Crook. Neither of us opened our mouths until we came to the edge of Forrest Ann's farm, and Rita grabbed my arm. Isn't that Dr. Sipes' car parked there? I'd like to talk to him. I laughed. Of course not. It isn't 5 o'clock yet. Rita turned to me with a puzzled look on her face. What does the time have to do with it? I wish I hadn't been so quick. Nothing. Oh, come on, Queenie. What do you mean about the 5 o'clock? Rita still held the broken feather in her hand, and she reached over and touched the tip of it to my cheek. Tell me. I shrugged. Queenie Bean, are you saying that Dr. Sipes calls on Forrest Ann every evening at 5 o'clock? Rita patted her lips with the feather. She sure was smart at figuring out things. Maybe not Ben Crook's murder, but other things. Not every day. After all, he's got sick people to see to. Well, I think that's kind of romantic, even at their age. We've had 1 birth and 2 funerals since I came here. Maybe next we'll have a wedding. No such thing. Doc Sipes is married. I stopped myself too late. I might just as well have dug a big hole and jumped into it. Rita leaned back in the seat and giggled. In Harveyville, Kansas, no less. Well, I'll be damned. This town's getting to be a regular tobacco road. I didn't understand. This is the Auburn Road. Oh, Queenie, Rita laughed again, as if I'd said something funny. Maybe we ought to pay Forrest Ann a friendly visit. We could say we were driving by and just stop to chat. People around here are always stopping by without an invitation, whether you want them to or not. Forrest Ann and Doc Sipes isn't something we interfere with. We pretend it's not going on, I said. She's a member of the Persian Pickle Club, so we stand by her even if we don't approve, which I'm not saying we do or don't. Forrest Ann deserves a little kindness, and so does Doc. Miss Sipes is meaner than Mrs. than Ma Barker, and Doc is a saint, just a saint. Nobody could blame him for taking up with Forrest Ann. I stepped on the gas just in case Rita was serious about stopping, but I wasn't fast enough. She leaned over and tooted the horn, and Doc stuck his head out from the porch and waved for us to turn in. Darn it, I guess we're calling on Forrest Ann after all, I muttered. We're not spying on them, Rita said. This is kind of like a professional call. I want to ask Doc about Ben Crook's body. He's the coroner, isn't he? The what? You know, the man who cuts up the bodies to find out what people died of? I shuddered. I'd rather pick cotton. Rita laughed, and although I was down on her for saying I couldn't keep a secret, and then for honking at Dr. Sipes when I heard the pretty sound that her voice made, I thought how much I liked her after all. I loved Ruby, but being with her was like looking into a mirror. Ruby and I did things exactly alike, and sometimes I knew what she was going to say before she did. And Rita was a surprise, and she made life interesting. Rita was what she would have called a real live wire, and it was exciting to be around her. When I turned off the motor, I saw Forrest Ann in the shade of the porch next to Dr. Sipes. She moved away from him as we came up. She didn't look glad to see us, and I tried to think of a way to let her know I wasn't the one who honked. Dr. Sipes nodded as we got out of the car. Rita already had out her notepad and the pencil I'd given her. She only glanced at Forrest Ann before she turned to Doc with the smile she'd used on the others she interviewed that day. Before she could ask a single question, however, Doc said, I'm glad you girls came along. I just stopped to tell Forrest Ann about Tyrone. I walked up next to the porch, and when I turned to Forrest Ann to see what he meant, I saw tears on her cheeks. Doc thinks Tyrone's got the polio, Forrest Ann sobbed. Oh no, I said. Just like the president, Rita asked. Albert told me just now he left Tyrone only 10 minutes ago. Who? I asked. Dr. Sipes, Dr. Albert Sipes, Forrest Ann said. I'd never thought about a doctor having a first name. It might not be polio. I don't know what it is for sure, so I'm not going to quarantine him just yet. Doc knew how hard a quarantine was on people. When her middle girl was quarantined with scarlet fever, Ada Jane said she thought she'd go crazy with no one to comfort her. Some people wouldn't even talk to her on the telephone, and when the Persian Pickles came with their cakes and potato salads, they had to leave them on the stump outside the house and yell at Ada Jane at the top of their lungs to come and get them. It might be just one of those sicknesses Tyrone gets this time of year, Doc said, glancing at Forrest Ann. What he meant was that Tyrone always took to his bed at harvest time. Doc removed his hat and used the back of his hand to rub the sweat off his forehead. Tyrone's never been a well person, Forrest Ann said. Since he was her brother, Forrest Ann had to defend him, but the rest of us knew Tyrone wasn't as sickly as he was lazy. I stopped to tell Forrest Ann because Velma's off somewheres, Doc said. Nettie's taking care of him by herself. Tyrone's not an easy man to deal with in a sick bed, or any place else, I muttered, and Doc turned away so Forrest Ann wouldn't see him smile. We'll all help, I told him. I'll go home and call Opalina and Sarah's and Ada Jane. Rita can let the Ritters know. We'll have to make do without Ella and Mrs. Judd. I tried to remember what I had at home that I could take over for the Burgett supper. Ella would want to help, Rita said suddenly, and Forrest Ann and I looked at each other. She's right, Forrest Ann said. Ella's never forgive us if somebody was in need and she didn't know about it. Helping Nettie will take her mind off her own troubles. It's just the ticket for her, Rita said, and she looked pleased. I was pleased as well. Rita was thinking like a pickle. Then I wondered if her real reason for the suggestion was she wanted another chance to question Ella. Come on, Rita, let's get going. We were out on the highway by the time Rita remembered she had a pencil in her hand. Oh, damn it, I forgot to ask Doc about being crook. I thought that was about the only thing Rita had done right that day. So there we all were at the Burgett place, and just like we'd been at the Ritters when Rita had the baby, and at Opalina's after Ella's husband was dug up. It seemed as if we had more sorrow this year than sewing. Tyrone was in bed in the parlor, which was where we gathered when Nettie was the hostess of Persian Pickle. With the lights turned off and the shades pulled down, it was the coolest room in the house, much nicer than the hot kitchen where we sat. The parlor door was closed, but we heard Tyrone thrashing around in there. Every few minutes he cussed from the pain of not cussed from the pain or from feeling sorry for himself, who knew which. He'd yell for Nettie to come in here, and when she did, he'd yell at her to get out. The only smart thing Tyrone ever did was marry Nettie. I wouldn't walk across the front porch for Tyrone Burgett, but there's not much a body wouldn't do for Nettie. Mrs. Judd said, taking the wax paper from around her perfection salad, which sat on one of the Haviland plates she used at Pickle, "It's a pity we don't have a pest house anymore. That's the place for Tyrone." Nettie was in the parlor with Tyrone, but Mrs. Judd might have said that even if Nettie had been in the room. I was sure she'd have said if Tyrone was there, especially after the dust-up they had over Hiawatha moving to Harveyville. Ella was right behind Mrs. Judd, the color back on her face, helping people perked her up. She carried a mason jar filled with purple asters, set them down in the dry sink, and then dipped water out of a bucket into the jar. "Tyrone doesn't care for flowers. They're for Nettie," Mrs. Judd explained. "We stopped at Ella's place on the way so she could pick them." Tyrone let out a swear word, and Opalina frowned. "There's no need for him to blaspheme the Lord. Nellie ought to smack him when he talks like that. A good smacking 'd help his disposition. This is the one time I wish Foster Olive would show up. We could send him right in to see Tyrone. It would serve both those men right," Sarah said. Even Sarah's, who got along with everybody, found little to like about Tyrone Burgett. Nettie came into the kitchen looking tired and sweaty and smelling like a sick room. She was startled to see that so many of the Pickles were there. Tears came to her eyes as she smiled at each one of us and glanced at the food we'd set out. The perfection salad set in the place of honor in the center of the table, the celery and carrots sparkling like 5 and dime jewels, and when I moved aside, a beam of sunshine shot through the window, causing the clear gelatin to shimmer. It was so pretty that Nettie drew in her breath, then threw her arms around Mrs. Judd. "Oh, Septima, I never saw a thing as lovely as that." Mrs. Judd looked surprised and a little embarrassed at the compliment as she patted Nettie's back. I've never seen anybody hug Mrs. Judd before. Just then the screen squeaked and the Ritter women came in. Mrs. Judd pulled away from Nettie to nod at Mrs. Ritter and Agnes T. Ritter. When she came to Rita, she looked her in the eye but didn't nod or say hello. Rita met her stare and swallowed a couple of times. She was uncomfortable, and so was I, as I wondered if Mrs. Judd was about to start something. Instead, she blew out her breath and said, "It's good you came, Rita. We always help one another." If Mrs. Judd was going to have words with Rita, it wouldn't be in Nettie's kitchen in front of the other Pickles. We visited as we set out the food and made coffee. Agnes T. Ritter drew water from the pump outside. Opalina built up the fire in the cook stove to heat the water, and she and Sarah's washed the dishes that were setting in the sink. Forrest Ann fed the chickens for Nettie while I carried out the garbage pail for the pigs. When we'd finished what there was to do, Mrs. Judd took charge and shooed out most of the Persian pickles. She told Forrest Ann to go home and rest, since she and Nettie would be taking turns setting up with Tyrone. Velma too, if she got home. Mrs. Judd said, then corrected herself, "when she gets home." The rest of us sighed with relief since we didn't want to tend Tyrone in a sick room. Queenie, you and Rita stay till Forrest Ann gets back. You're young and you'll cheer Nettie, Mrs. Judd said, taking Ella's arm and steering her out the door. Rita and I sat in the kitchen for a long time, making small talk, until Tyrone at last went to sleep, and Nettie came out of the parlor, fanning herself with her hand. Tyrone couldn't have looked any worse than Nettie did. I'm taking you out on the porch to cool off, I said, putting my hand in Nettie's. I led her outside, being careful not to let the screen door bang and wake up Tyrone. Nettie and Rita sat down on the glider while I found a place on the top step of the porch. For a few minutes we sat there, listening to the friendly squeak of the glider as we moved back and forth. Tyrone made a noise, and Nettie rose and went to the door and listened. But it was just a sound in his sleep, so she sat down again and put her head in her hands. You've got your share of troubles, Nettie, I told her. Oh, you don't know the half of it, Queenie, she replied. Nettie might have said something more, but Rita put her hand on Nettie's arm to show she cared, and Nettie looked up in surprise, as if she'd forgotten Rita was there. Instead of continuing, Nettie squeezed Rita's hand and said, I wonder where Forrest Ann's got to. She didn't mention Velma. Forrest Ann's resting. She went home for a while. Rita and I will stay until she gets here. I expect she'll be along presently, I said, getting up. I stood behind Nettie and rubbed her shoulders to soften the ache. I knew was there, and to comfort her. We stayed like that for a long time, just listening to Kansas night sounds, which would have their own way of giving comfort, even if I didn't feel the need for talking. Finally, Forrest Ann drove up, apologizing for being so late. She'd laid down to rest for a few minutes and had fallen fast asleep. When Nettie told her Tyrone was sleeping, Forrest Ann wasn't in any hurry to go inside, and she leaned on the porch post while we said our goodbyes to Nettie. Then Forrest Ann walked Rita and me to the car and held the door open while I got in. She shut my door, and I rolled down the window to say the Massey boy would be over in the morning to do the milking and to help with chores. In their own way, the Masseys like to be neighborly, I explained, not telling her that Grover and I were paying Sonny 5 cents a day to help Nettie. It was well after 10 o'clock and as black as the inside of a barn when Rita and I left the Burgetts. I told Rita I sure was glad for the fellow who invented headlights. It's the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8's next. See y'all.